The mansion was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning as I wandered its dimly lit halls. Grandpa's death had left me the reluctant heir to this hulking, decaying beast of a home. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, and the overgrown woods outside pressed against the windows like silent onlookers. I almost missed the door the first time I passed it, tucked into the farthest corner of the second floor. It blended into the shadows, a thick iron door, padlocked and scarred. My breath caught in my throat as a memory surfaced, Grandpa's sharp voice, warning me to never touch it. Promise me, he'd said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. Yet here I was, hand trembling as I reached toward the rusted lock, a strange chill seeping into my skin. I let my hand hover near the lock, my fingers brushing against the cold, corroded surface before I pulled back. A wave of unease washed over me, leaving my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. The hallway was silent, save for the faint creaks of the old house settling. But I could have sworn I felt something watching me. Shaking off the thought, I stepped back and turned away from the door, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand, sorting through the houses. Many years of clutter and decay. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though the thought of the door lingered like an itch in the back of my mind. I explored the attic that evening, its rafters heavy with cobwebs and dust. Boxes upon boxes of family heirlooms sat piled around me, their contents mostly unremarkable old photographs, faded letters, trinkets from a lifelong past. It wasn't until I stumbled across a leather-bound journal tucked away inside a hollowed-out book that the oddities began again. The journal felt wrong in my hands, its cover unnaturally warm, as though it had been resting under sunlight instead of hidden in the dark. Inside, the pages were brittle but legible. Most of it was mundane daily musings from someone who lived here decades ago, but toward the end, the tone shifted. The door must stay locked. It knows how to feed on secrets, how to twist the mind until you're no longer yourself. Father says he hears it at night, calling for him, begging him. But I will not give in. I will not. The entry ended abruptly, the pen's line jagged, as if the writer had been yanked away mid-thought. A chill prickled the back of my neck, and before I could think, I slammed the journal shut and shoved it back into its hiding place. I told myself it was nonsense, just a frightened imagination from someone long dead. But as I climbed down from the attic, a faint sound stopped me in my tracks. Scratching. It was soft at first, barely audible over the distant hum of the wind, but it grew louder as I stood, frozen, coming unmistakably from the direction of the locked room. The scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something or someone on the other side of the locked door knew I was there and wanted me to know it too. I stood at the base of the attic stairs, my breath shallow, heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out the quiet creaks of the old house. I told myself it was a rat. An animal must have gotten trapped inside somehow. But deep down, I didn't believe that. It was too deliberate, too insistent, and worse, too human. Compelled by a mix of dread and morbid curiosity, I descended the stairs, my footsteps muffled against the worn carpet runner. The hallway was cloaked in shadow, the single overhead light flickering weakly. The door loomed at the end, its iron surface catching the dim light like a warning. Just leave it alone, I whispered to myself, though my legs carried me closer with every step. The scratching had stopped, leaving the air thick and heavy with silence. My fingers grazed the padlock once more, and this time, a faint vibration seemed to pulse from the door itself, as if something behind it was alive. I yanked my hand back and stumbled a step away. That's when I saw it, the photograph. It had fallen from somewhere, landing face up at my feet. In the sepia-toned image, my grandfather stood in front of the very same door. His face was expressionless, his posture stiff, but his eyes, they were hollow, terrified, as though he knew something I didn't. On the back, a single sentence was scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. You must never open it. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I dropped the photo as though it burned my fingers. The house seemed to groan around me, the distant walls creaking in protest. I turned on my heel, retreating to the relative safety of the living room. But as I sat there, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace, the journal's words echoed in my mind. It knows how to feed on secrets. And then came the whisper. Soft at first, almost a trick of the wind, but unmistakable. Come closer. I froze, gripping the armrest of the chair so hard my knuckles turned white. The whisper was faint but distinct, a breathy voice that seemed to seep into my ears from all directions. Come closer. The sound slithered through the silence, tugging at some dark curiosity deep within me. I wanted to run, to lock myself in one of the bedrooms and pretend I hadn't heard it. But the voice, it wasn't just calling. It was pleading. Before I realized it, I was on my feet, the journal from the attic clutched in my trembling hands, flipped through the brittle pages, desperate to make sense of the warning I'd found earlier. Final entry was even more ominous now. It feeds on secrets, on pain. The door is not a barrier, it's a tether. If you get too close, it will find you. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The firelight flickered low, throwing long, jagged shadows across the room. They seemed to stretch unnaturally, their edges sharp and predatory. My gaze darted to the doorway. The house had fallen silent again, but I could feel it, something waiting. Just beyond the edge of perception, patient and hungry. I should have stopped. I should have thrown the journal into the fire and left the house without looking back. Instead, I flipped through more of the entries, hoping for answers, but finding only dread. The handwriting became messier, more erratic, the writer's desperation evident. Father heard it first, just like I do now. It knows. It always knows. He thought he could control it, but he was wrong. The word wrong was underlined so violently that the pen had torn through the paper. The entry ended with a single chilling line. If you hear it whisper, it's already too late. I slammed the journal shut, heart racing. The air around me felt oppressive, thick like syrup, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were closing in. And then it came again, closer. This time, the whisper carried a trace of something sharper, something mocking, as if the voice knew I couldn't resist. My feet moved before my mind could stop them, carrying me back, toward the hallway, and the locked door. The hallway seemed longer now, stretched impossibly so, with the locked door looming at the far end like a dark eye staring back at me. My hands were clammy, the journal clutched tightly against my chest, its brittle pages crinkling under the pressure. Every step felt like a choice, a final opportunity to turn back, but something stronger than fear pulled me forward. When I reached the door, the air was colder than the rest of the house, almost frigid. My breath became invisible puffs, and a faint vibration thrummed through the iron surface. The rusted padlock seemed impossibly old, yet the chain holding it in place looked strangely polished, as though it had been tended to recently. Without thinking, I crouched to inspect it closer. That's when I saw the scratches. Not just claw marks gouged into the wood, but something deeper, carved into the door itself. Do not feed it. The letters were jagged, uneven, as if the carver had been in a hurry or terrified. I should have left then. I know that now. But my fingers were already moving, digging into my pocket, where I had placed the ornate key I'd found earlier in the attic. Its intricate design felt oddly warm against my palm, the metal smooth and inviting. The journal's warnings echoed in my head. If you hear it whisper, it's already too late. And yet, my hand was steady as I slid the key into the lock. The mechanism groaned in protest, stiff and reluctant, but after a moment, it gave way with a sharp click. The chain slithered to the floor like a dead snake, and the door creaked open an inch. The cold hit me first, a wave of freezing air that burned my lungs and numbed my face. Then came the smell, damp earth, rot, and something sweet but cloying, like decayed flowers. Pushed the door open further, and my eyes adjusted to the dim light of the room beyond. It was small, almost suffocating, with walls lined in peeling wallpaper. The room's centerpiece was a single heavy wooden desk, its surface layered in dust. An old mirror hung on the far wall, its glass cracked and clouded. The air felt wrong, heavy and charged, as though the room itself was alive. Then I saw it. On the desk sat a small photograph, framed in tarnished silver. It was the same one I had found. Earlier, Grandpa standing before this very door, his face pale and empty. But here, the photograph was different. In this version, his face was twisted into an expression of sheer terror, his mouth wide in a silent scream. And behind him, in the shadowed sliver of the door, two glowing eyes stared back at me. My blood ran cold as I stared at the photograph. The glowing eyes behind my grandfather burned into my vision, their amber light flickering like fire. I wanted to look away, to back out of the room and slam the door shut, but my legs wouldn't move. The air seemed heavier now, pressing down on me like a weight, and with every passing second, the dim light in the room seemed to fade. Then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, a whisper slithered forth. "You shouldn't have come." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority, a presence that rooted me in place. The mirror on the far wall trembled, its cracked surface shimmering unnaturally. My breath quickened as I turned toward it, drawn by an instinct I couldn't resist. The reflection wasn't mine. In the mirror's fractured depths, a figure stood where I should have been. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs stretched to unnatural lengths. Its face, or what passed for one, was a shifting void, a swirling mass of darkness punctuated only by those same glowing eyes. They locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world around me seemed to vanish. "You've opened the door," it hissed, its voice now echoing in my head. "You'll feed me now." I stumbled backward, clutching the journal to my chest like a lifeline. My eyes darted back to the photograph on the desk, now visibly shaking as though caught in a violent storm. The face of my grandfather was changing, morphing, his scream twisting into something worse, a grin, wide and unnatural, stretching far beyond what a human mouth should allow. The walls of the room began to groan, the peeling wallpaper curling back to reveal dark, oozing wood beneath. Shadows spilled from the corners, pooling at my feet, climbing up my legs like living tendrils. Stop," I screamed, my voice breaking. "What do you want?" The figure in the mirror tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. The shadows tightened their grip, pinning me in place. Everything it said, its voice calm now, almost amused. "Your pain, your secrets, they are mine now." The journal. It was the only thing I had left. Desperately, I fumbled to open it, flipping through its pages for anything that might help me. The shadows tightened, creeping toward my throat, and my vision blurred as panic set in. Then I saw at the final page. "It can be trapped. It feeds on the truth you cannot bear. Give it what it craves and bind it once more." My heart sank. The truth I couldn't bear? I didn't even know where to begin. The room spun as the shadows tightened around me, suffocating and cold. My chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths. The creature in the mirror leaned closer, its glowing eyes boring into mine as though it could see every corner of my mind, every fear and regret I had ever buried. "Give it to me," the voice whispered, softer now, almost tender. "Your truth, your pain. Show me." I clutched the journal like a lifeline, the brittle pages trembling under my grip. The final instruction was maddeningly vague: "Give it what it craves." But what did that even mean? My mind raced, sifting through memories, trying to latch onto anything I had locked away, any secret I had refused to confront. And then it hit me. The memory surged forth, unbidden and raw. The night my mother had left us, the fight she'd had with my father echoing through the house like thunder. I had been a child hiding on the stairs, clutching a stuffed animal as I watched her storm out the door. My father's broken sobs had haunted me for years. But what haunted me more was the truth I had never shared. I begged her to leave that night, whispered it through tears, told her I hated her. The weight of the memory crushed me as the shadows writhed around me, sensing the shift. Tears streamed down my face as I forced myself to speak, my voice cracking. I told her to go," I choked out, my words spilling into the cold, suffocating air. I wanted her to leave. I hated her, and she left. And it's my fault. The room shuddered, the walls groaning as though the house itself was reacting to my confession. The creature in the mirror seemed to grow, its form swelling with the weight of my words. The shadows recoiled momentarily before surging forward again, more aggressive this time. More, it hissed, its voice hungry and relentless. "Give me more." I fought against the crushing weight of the shadows, every fiber of my being screaming to stop. But I knew what had to be done. The truth wasn't just painful, it was my key to survival. "I'm a coward," I shouted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I let everyone go because I'm afraid. I don't deserve this house. I don't deserve any of it." The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, shards raining down in slow motion. The shadows reared back, twisting violently as if in agony. The room filled with an ear-splitting howl, the voice of the creature losing its mocking edge, now filled with rage. The journal burned in my hands, its pages igniting with a blue flame that didn't scorch my skin. The words on the final page began to glow, their meaning clearer now. Sacrifice your truth to bind it. It will take what it needs and nothing more. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I thrust the journal toward the darkness. The shadows enveloped it, swallowing the flames whole, and the howling grew louder until it reached a breaking point. Then, silence. I stood in the silence, my body trembling as the last echoes of the creature's howl faded into nothingness. The shadows that had gripped me dissolved into thin wisps, retreating into the corners of the room like smoke caught in a draft. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, and my legs buckled beneath me. I sank to the cold, damp floor, staring at the empty space where the journal had been consumed. The room felt different now, emptier, but not safer. The walls still oozed with dark stains, the wallpaper curling at the edges like burnt paper. But the oppressive weight that had suffocated me moments ago was gone. I glanced at the shattered mirror, its broken shards scattered across the floor, reflecting fractured versions of the room. My reflection was nowhere to be seen. I scrambled to my feet, the ache in my body nearly overwhelming, and stumbled toward the door. It swung open with a groan before I even touched it, as if the house itself had decided to release me. The hallway beyond was eerily silent, the flickering light above now steady and warm. My legs carried me away from the room, down the stairs, and into the living room without a single thought. I wanted nothing more than to leave, to flee this house and never return, but my body felt heavy, as if the house still held some part of me. I paused by the fireplace, its embers now cold and gray, and caught my reflection in the dark glass of an old clock. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, but something else was wrong, something I couldn't quite place. I reached up, my fingers brushing the skin beneath my eyes. It was damp, not with sweat, but with something cold and sticky. Blood. Panic surged through me as I wiped at my face, the crimson smearing across my palms. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened, but all I could think about was the creatures. Words, "You'll feed me now." I stumbled out of the mansion, gasping for air as the night pressed down around me. The cold wind bit at my skin, but it felt cleaner than the suffocating air inside. My car was parked at the edge of the overgrown driveway, a lifeline waiting to take me far from this cursed place. But as I approached, a wave of nausea stopped me in my tracks. The weight on my chest hadn't lifted, and every shadow seemed to lean toward me, stretching unnaturally in the moonlight. I glanced back at the house, its dark windows like eyes watching me, accusing me. I climbed into the car and started the engine, desperate to leave, but my hands trembled on the steering wheel. The journal was gone, the creature vanquished, or so I thought. Yet, as the headlights illuminated the winding driveway ahead, a voice whispered faintly in my ear, "Not enough." I slammed on the brakes, heart hammering in my chest. The whisper had been so clear, so close. I twisted in my seat, scanning the empty back seat, the dark woods beyond the car. But there was nothing there. My breathing was ragged, my mind teetering on the edge of panic. Forcing myself to focus, I drove on, putting as much distance as I could between me and the mansion. The winding road twisted through the forest, the trees crowding the narrow path like sentinels. But the farther I drove, the more the road felt unfamiliar. The headlights flickered, briefly, and when they steadied again, I found myself back at the mansion's driveway. "No," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "No, no, no." I spun the car around and floored the gas pedal, speeding back into the forest. The road stretched on endlessly this time, the trees towering higher, their branches gnarled and clawing at the sky. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder with every mile. "Closer. You'll feed me. You can't leave," I screamed, slamming my hands against the steering wheel as the car sputtered and slowed. The engine died, plunging me into darkness. The shadows in the trees shifted, swaying as if alive, and then I saw them, two glowing eyes, hovering just beyond the windshield, burning with a hungry light. I scrambled to open the door, but the locks wouldn't budge. My reflection in the rearview mirror caught my attention, and I froze. It wasn't me anymore. My face was hollow, my eyes glowing, faintly with the same amber light as the creatures. My mouth moved on its own, whispering words I couldn't hear. The final whisper came from everywhere and nowhere, as familiar as my own voice. "You'll never leave. Not while I'm still hungry." The headlights flickered one last time, illuminating the mansion at the end of the driveway. I was. Back again, no matter how far I ran. The house loomed, waiting for me to return and feed it once more. What did you think of the ending? Let me know if you'd have handled the shadow differently. I was desperate for money, plain and simple. College loans were eating me alive, and between tuition, rent, and groceries, I couldn't see the end of the tunnel. So when I saw the flyer pinned to the bulletin board in the student union, I didn't think twice. House sitter wanted. Remote property. $1,000 per night. Must be available. Immediately. It was too good to be true, of course, but desperation has a way of blinding you. The phone. Number scrawled at the bottom in shaky handwriting practically called out to me. I dialed it as soon as I got back to my apartment. The man who answered introduced himself as Mr. Eldridge. His voice was low and gravelly, like he'd spent years smoking unfiltered cigarettes, but he was polite enough. After a brief exchange about my availability, he invited me to the house that same evening to discuss the terms. I almost didn't go. Something about the whole situation felt off, but when you're broke, $1,000 a night has a way of silencing your gut instincts. I arrived at the house just before sunset. It was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods and shrouded in an eerie silence that set my teeth on edge. The house itself was massive Victorian style, with turrets and a steeply pitched roof that gave it a distinctly haunted look. Mr. Eldridge met me at the door. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a wiry frame and thin, silver hair slicked back from his face. His clothes were neat but outdated, like he hadn't updated his wardrobe in decades. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice as raspy as I remembered. "Come in. Let's discuss the job." The interior of the house was as unsettling as its exterior. The walls were lined with bookshelves, stuffed with ancient tomes, and the furniture was antique, covered in faded upholstery. There was an oppressive weight to the air, as if the house were holding its breath. Mr. Eldridge led me to the sitting room, where a small table had been set with 2 cups of tea. He gestured for me to sit, then took the chair opposite mine. "The job is simple," he began. "I need someone to watch the house for 3 nights. I'll be away. On business. And I can't leave it unattended." "That's it?" I asked, unable to hide my skepticism. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Not quite. There are rules you must follow. Strictly." He pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and slid it across the table. I picked it up, reading over the list of instructions written in the same shaky handwriting as the flyer. 1. Lock every door and window before sunset. 2. Do not look out any windows after dark, even if you hear something. 3. If the phone rings after 11 p.m., do not answer it. 4. Leave a glass of water in every room at all times. 5. Do not go into the basement, no matter what you hear. I laughed nervously. "This is a joke, right?" Mr. Eldridge's expression hardened. "I assure you it is not. The house has certain peculiarities. These rules are for your safety." My mouth went dry. There was no trace of humor in his voice, no hint of a smirk. He was deadly serious. "If you can't follow the rules," he continued, "I'll find someone else. But the pay remains the same, $1,000 per night, paid in cash." I hesitated. The logical part of me wanted to walk out the door, but the promise of money that could wipe out my rent for months, kept me in my seat. "I'll do it," I said finally. Mr. Eldridge handed me the keys, along with an envelope containing the first night's payment. "I'll return in 3 days. If you have any questions, do not call me after 11 p.m. Before I could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving me alone in the massive, creaking house. I spent the first hour wandering the rooms, getting a feel for the place. It was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything was old, from the faded wallpaper to the dusty chandeliers. But what struck me most were the artifacts. Every surface seemed to be cluttered with strange trinkets jars, filled with murky liquids, animal bones arranged in intricate patterns, and photographs of people whose faces had been scratched out. I locked every door and window as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house growing dimmer with each passing minute. By the time I finished, the whole place felt like a tomb, cold and silent. I placed a glass of water in each room, as instructed, though I didn't understand why. Then I waited. The first few hours were uneventful. I kept the lights on, scrolling through my phone to distract myself. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, the house began to change. It started with the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. At first I thought it might be the old pipes or the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate, too Human. My throat tightened as I remembered the rules. Don't look out any windows after dark. Don't answer the phone after 11 p.m. Don't go into the basement. I gripped my phone, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then the footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft tapping at the window. I froze. The tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I stared at the floor, refusing to look up, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving the house in an eerie silence. I didn't sleep. In that night, morning came slowly, the pale light of dawn creeping through the curtains. I unlocked the doors and windows, breathing a sigh of relief as I stepped onto the porch. For the first time, I noticed something strange. The glasses of water I'd left in each room were empty, as if someone or something had drained them during the night. I told myself it didn't matter. The job was just 3 nights. I could handle it, or so I thought. The day passed in a blur of exhaustion. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling from the night before, and every little noise seemed amplified, as though the house itself was alive. But $1,000 a night was $1,000 a night. I had to stick it out. As the sun began to set, I locked the doors and windows again, methodically checking each one. The glasses of water were all replaced and filled to the brim, even though I didn't understand their purpose. I felt a little foolish following the rules so carefully, but something deep in my gut told me it was better not to question them. By the time darkness fully settled, the oppressive atmosphere from the first night had returned, heavier than before. The house seemed to creak more often, as though the wooden beams and floorboards were groaning under some unseen weight. I kept the lights on in every room, moving from one to the next, trying to stay occupied. Around 10 p.m., I decided to settle in the sitting room with a book, hoping to distract myself. That's when I heard the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. It was the same deliberate, rhythmic pacing I'd heard the night before. My chest tightened as the footsteps continued, moving from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. I gripped the book. In my hands, every muscle in my body tensing. Don't go upstairs, I reminded myself. Don't break the rules. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling again, but the sound was too clear too intentional. I stayed rooted to the couch, my ears straining to follow the sound. Then came the tapping, soft at first, like the gentle knock of a fingertip against glass. It was coming from the window, directly behind me. I froze. Don't look out any windows after dark, even if you hear something. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there knew I was ignoring it. My breath caught in my throat as the rhythm became erratic, fingers drumming on the glass. Then, fists pounding. Don't look. Don't look. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as the sound escalated. Suddenly it stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards upstairs. And then I heard it, a whisper. Why won't you look at me? The voice was soft, almost childlike, but laced with something far more sinister. My heart thundered in my chest as I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the sound to go away. It was just my imagination. It had to be. The sound of shattering glass snapped my eyes open. The room was empty, but the window pane was splintered, cracks spreading outward like a web. A faint breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of something foul like rotting leaves and damp earth. I stayed on the couch until dawn, too terrified to move. The next day I debated whether to leave. The money wasn't worth it, not if I was going to lose my mind in this house. But the thought of giving up and returning to my broke, miserable resistance made me stay. That evening, as I prepared for the third night, the phone rang. It wasn't even 11 p.m. Yet, I hesitated, staring at the old rotary phone sitting on the hallway table. My hand hovered over the receiver as it continued to ring. Finally, I picked it up, my voice shaking as I said, "Hello. Have you been following the rules?" The voice on the other end was Mr. Eldridge's, but it sounded distant, warped, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Yes," I whispered. "Good," he replied. "You must continue. The house. It's older than you think. They are drawn to mistakes. Whatever you do, don't break any more rules." Before I could respond, the line went dead. By the third night, the house was alive with activity. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, darting across the walls and ceilings. The glasses of water I'd placed in every room seemed to ripple on their own, disturbed by vibrations I couldn't hear or feel. Around midnight, the noises from the basement began. It started as a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. Then came the muffled voices. low and garbled, as though a crowd of people were murmuring just below the floor. "Don't go into the basement," the rule repeated in my head, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. My curiosity and fear got the better of me. Grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen, I made my way to the basement door. The air grew colder as I descended the creaking stairs. The scratching was louder now, echoing off the stone walls. At the bottom, I found a padlocked door. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, clear and deliberate, whispered from the other side of the door. "Help us." I dropped the flashlight and bolted back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, my ears ringing with the sound of that voice. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, the house fell silent again. I unlocked the doors, leaving them ajar as I packed my bag. I was done. No amount of money was worth another night in that house. As I stepped outside, Mr. Eldridge's car pulled up the driveway. He got out looking as calm and composed as ever, but his expression darkened when he saw me. "You opened the basement door, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. "I didn't go in," I stammered. "You shouldn't have done that," he interrupted. "Now they know you." "What? What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me an envelope stuffed with cash and said, "Take this and leave. And don't ever come back." I didn't argue. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the house receding into the distance. But all I saw was darkness, swallowing the road behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the house, the envelope of cash burning a hole in the passenger seat. My hands shook on the wheel, and my stomach churned with a mix of terror and regret. I should have left after the first night. I should have listened to Mr. Eldridge's rules. But curiosity and fear had gotten the better of me. I thought the nightmare was over. I was wrong. It started small. That night, in the cheap motel room where I'd holed up, I saw a flicker of movement in the bathroom mirror. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. But then I noticed the glass of water I'd placed by the bedside, something I'd done out of sheer habit, was empty. I hadn't touched it. The whispers came next. I woke in the middle of the night to a soft murmuring, like voices speaking just outside the door. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The words were indistinct, but the tone was familiar, pleading, desperate. The same voices I'd heard in the basement. "Help us." I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but the sound only grew louder. The air in the room turned icy, and the light above me flickered. When I finally worked up the courage to open my eyes, the room was empty. But the glass of water was full again, as if something had refilled it. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I left the motel and drove, aimlessly trying to outrun the feeling of being watched. No matter where I went, though, it followed me. The whispers, the flickering shadows, the glasses of water that always seemed to drain and refill themselves. It didn't take long for me to realize the truth. The house hadn't let me go. "They know you now," Mr. Eldridge had said. I didn't understand what they were, but I knew. I couldn't escape them. I tried calling him, desperate for answers, but his number was disconnected. When I drove back to the address where the house had stood, I found nothing but an empty lot. No house, no driveway, just an overgrown field. I wasn't losing my mind. I'd seen it. I'd been there. The shadows grew bolder as the days passed. They no longer waited at the edges of my vision. They moved openly, twisting unnaturally across walls and ceilings. At night, the whispers turned into screams, filling the room with an unearthly cacophony that made it impossible to sleep. I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted, terrified, and out of options. I knew the house, or whatever was tied to it, wanted something from me, and I was going to find out what. I returned to the field where the house had once stood, clutching a flashlight and the note with Mr. Eldridge's rules, now worn and crumpled. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. "Help us, please." I followed the sound to the center of the field, where the earth was soft and freshly turned. My hands trembled as I began to dig, clawing at the dirt with my bare hands. The whispers grew louder with every handful of soil I unearthed, until finally I hit something solid wood. It was a small box, ancient and covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under the beam of my flashlight. I hesitated, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, but something compelled me to open it. Inside was a photograph, old and yellowed with age. It showed a group of people standing in front of the house, Mr. Eldridge among them. Their faces were solemn, their eyes dark and lifeless. Scrawled on the back of the photo were the words, "They are bound to the house. And now, so are you." As I stared at the photograph, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. And then I felt it, a presence behind me. Slowly I turned, and for the first time I saw them. They weren't human. Their forms were twisted, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces a blur of shifting features. They moved toward me in unison, their empty eyes locked onto mine. I dropped the box and ran, but I didn't make it far. They were faster, surrounding me in moments. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the house, rising out of the earth, its windows glowing like hungry eyes. When I woke, I was back in the sitting room of the house. The glasses of water were still in their places, and the rules were still on the table. But this time I wasn't alone. I could feel them, there, presence lingering just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for me to break the rules again. I was no longer a guest. I was part of the house now. Could you follow all the rules, or would curiosity get the better of you? Tell us which rule you'd struggle with the most.